usual!
Hey there, Gothamites. Welcome to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City, and now certainly beyond, Dr. Drea Letamendi. Hello, Drea.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm excited. I know that I've been tentative about this whole Steven Universe thing.
You've been a naysayer.
Not a naysayer. I just hadn't seen the show, so I didn't know what to expect.
You've been reluctant.
Yes, I was. To say that I was reluctant would certainly be accurate. We've explained it before. It's because we have never seen it, and to us, it looked like potentially a show that is similar to those. I don't know, dating back to when I was a kid. You know, you've got Rugrats, you've got Powerpuff Girls, you've got Adventure Time, you've got now Steven Universe. You've got shows that are ostensibly for children, but are certainly welcomed and appreciated by adults because of it's got a lot of hidden adult humor and innuendo, and it's fun, but I didn't know if it would be psychologically deep or relevant. And people have been telling us that it absolutely is, but they've also been saying that it gets that way over the course of its several seasons. So I didn't know if season 1, which is supposedly all we are currently covering, was going to have a good representation on the Arkham Sessions. But now, having seen the first 5 episodes, I would say I'm looking forward to seeing more.
Yes, you've been won over.
I wouldn't necessarily call myself a convert yet,
okay, but
I'm certainly getting there. How do you feel, your first take on this Steven Universe?
It's funny because I've never seen the show, and yet here I am enthusiastic about continuing, certainly with this season, and maybe convincing you to do more. Mainly because the people
you don't have to convince me to do more. You have to
well,
it's
really up to our
more.
Listeners.
Yeah.
The folks that I talk to who are fans of the show speak about it in with such love, with such adoration.
It's like a reverence.
Yes, and they say it's so special to them, and this is why I'm in favor of embracing the show. And you named some shows that perhaps influenced the tone, or at least some of the writing of Steven Universe. Going back, I want to acknowledge that going back to when you and I were growing up, this idea of animation being written for all ages and potentially for some of its features to be intended for adult audiences and viewers.
You have those early shows. Nickelodeon was probably famous for them prior to the Cartoon Network era. You had Hey Arnold, you had Doug, you had Recess.
Don't sleep on Ren and Stimpy. Do not sleep on Ren and Stimpy.
I'm absolutely not sleeping on Ren and Stimpy. But Ren and Stimpy was not a show for children. It was a show specifically designed for adults. Now children could get into it for sure. They could enjoy the big fat cat and the little chihuahua who are who hate one another and yet love one another. But it was not a show that was designed, I think, for children. This struck me as a show because of how clean it is, because the design is very simple. It seemed like another one of those shows that was sort of ostensibly for children with a lot for parents and adults, non-parents, to get into. And that's why I go back to those Nickelodeon shows like Rugrats. To me, I, as an adult, and certainly I, as a teen at the time, and then later on, I still enjoy Rugrats. I still enjoy shows like Animaniacs. I still enjoy shows like Powerpuff Girls, particularly the original incarnation of Powerpuff Girls. These were shows that were bright, colorful, simple. They mocked anime and yet lovingly paid homage to anime and other shows like that. But there was so much there for adults that kids just weren't going to pick up.
I have to acknowledge, too, that Steven Universe has an elevated consciousness, that there are themes and relationships and concepts here that we didn't see in the shows that you're
100%,
referencing.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the kids who grew up with those shows and then continued, early on in my life, cartoons were basically commercials for toys. I mean, you had Transformers, you had G.I. Joes. And by the way, I interviewed the creators of those shows, and I can tell you straight up, they were created to be toys, commercials. You had other cartoons that were simple, dating back to Warner Brothers, which certainly had a lot of innuendo, but was very simple in its plot. It is very simple in those shorts. Now, adults certainly can appreciate them. There were a lot of jokes in there that were for adults, but you didn't see shows like this until you started to see the kids who grew up on shows from Nickelodeon and The Simpsons and Futurama start to turn 20 and start to create their own animated series where suddenly you're allowed to create whole new worlds. And I think that's where we got the Justin Roilands and Rebecca Sugar, who created Steven Universe, and just people like that.
What's that show about the brother and sister who are adventuring kind of like in like
Gravity Falls?
Yes, exactly. I'm thinking about the folks that
same thing
created that show sort of had the background that you're describing right now.
Yeah, for sure. And we should say that I have never really seen Adventure Time. I'm sure I would love it if I were forced to sit down and watch it. In the same way that if I were forced to sit down and watch Steven Universe, I found that I really enjoyed it. But there's something about Adventure Time that just didn't ring for me. And again, having not seen it, I'm talking about just the imagery of it, and in some cases, just the zeal of the fans. There's something that can be off-putting about a show like that, especially if I view it as, I want to be very careful here, sort of a stoner type show, although I've been told that it's not, and I need to get into it. Similar to Rick and Morty. Rick and Morty to me seemed like a stoner show, and then I ended up watching it. You ended up watching it, and I was listening to it in the background. I'm like, God, this is a really smart show.
Yeah, it's a great show.
So I am open to so many more experiences like this, and I'm glad that we got here the way that we did. How did we get here, Drea? How did we get to Steven Universe?
We asked our listeners to take a poll. Actually, it was more of a vote.
A poll is a vote, yes. Yeah, you're right.
I believe initially, we gave them 3 choices. And there was a tight race between Steven Universe and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Yeah. And we realized that Steven Universe was clearly...
It wasn't just a tight race. It was a tie.
Yeah.
And then we removed the third option, which was Watchmen.
The distractor.
Yeah, we removed the third option, and then we gave our voters, our patrons, once again an opportunity to vote. And in that case, when you took Watchmen out of the equation, Steven Universe ran away with it. So I think it was like 68% of the vote or something like that. So
scratching my head at why people didn't vote for Watchmen, but there's certainly a lot of discourse right now about wholesome entertainment. And not that Watchmen isn't, Watchmen is such a fantastic show. But I imagine that our listeners and certainly our Patreon followers were giving us the statement that they wanted something lovable and wholesome. They wanted something that certainly they were already fans of, but that could create a space for, I don't know, I guess elevating Steven Universe to the types of discussions we would have. So I feel like this is a huge embrace of the show. And I have found that so far, given the 5 episodes we've seen, there is a lot of content. There's either like 11 or 12 minute episodes, but there is a lot to think about. And it's certainly, I would call it a very welcoming show, one that gently introduces us to topics of relationships and themes around coming of age, transitions, hardships, and this amazing kid who is delightful and charming and wonderful, and yet I feel like I'm about to see some things happen to him, and so I feel very protective of him. Like, oh boy, what is going to happen?
Well, let's introduce Steven Universe to those who are following along, our longtime listeners who have been here since Batman the Animated Series and have traveled with us through various movies and have listened to an entire season's worth of analysis for Doom Patrol. And maybe you don't know Steven Universe yet. Maybe you want to get to know this show a little bit. We did the first 5 episodes for this episode. They are 12-minute episodes. So they're really, really easy to get through. I mean, trust me, I've watched some 12-minute shows of other series that are not easy to get through. These are genuinely a treat. They seem simple on the surface. You were introduced to Steven, who is a young, pudgy, I think we decided that he was somewhere around 12 or so, 11 or 12. And this kid has been raised, it seems, by 3 superhero, possibly alien, possibly not characters that are all motivated by gems in their hands or in their chest, or in each one is located in a different place. You've got Pearl, who is extremely, I would say, alpha. She has a need for everything to be organized, and she is the one with the plans always. She seems to be the one that's sort of in charge. Then,
I like her a lot.
You would. Then you've got Garnet, who is she seems the most alien of the bunch. She speaks in a monotone for much of the time. She seems disengaged from a number of the other characters. She has a hyper power about her that is much more rigid, and she seems stronger than a number of the other characters. Whereas Amethyst seems more the most human and down to earth. She is the most like Steven. She is the almost,
she's playful and she's sort of like open to experiences.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's interesting as we think about their personality traits. Some of those traits are really appealing to us. And so, I noticed that we're using, you said like, Amethyst is very human, and it sounds like to be rigid and almost infallible isn't human. And I'd say, yeah, we tend to characterize rigidity with like AI or alienism, right?
Well, she's got a very robotic sense about her. Garnet does. Like she is very, she doesn't seem emotional when talking to the other people, I don't know, are they sisters?
They're
are they
gem persons? I don't know that. Well, we don't know yet.
Yeah.
We are still learning about them.
But they do have a sister like, they do have a sister, big sister like relationship with Steven, whose father is human, who we know he once released a CD, of an unsuccessful CD. He's a singer who lives in his van.
He's a kind of hippie person.
Hippie person, lives in his van. I believe either owns or works in the car wash. That's sort of what we are introduced to him through the second episode, Laser Light Cannon. But it almost seems to be by choice. I don't think he's living out of his van. I think he just dearly loves his van. It almost defines him.
Well, again, we don't know yet. It seems as though he seems to be in a situation where he works at the car wash or owns the car wash. Yeah. He has some kind of employment. And yet I got the impression that if Steven were to live with his father, he'd be living in that van.
Oh, yeah.
There's clearly and I assume we'll get to this point in this decision-making, this transition for Steven. He lives in a very comfortable home with the 3 gem women. And
it's an interesting home.
Yeah. But he has his own room, and he has his furniture and his dresser and his own clothes. And he's in that home, he has a lot of autonomy, but he's also a member of the family. There's some expectations held of him. And the reason I'm elucidating that is that he is in the role of a child in this home, that he has sort of these caregivers who are watching over him, but he's also a member of their team. His powers are emerging. He's discovering his gem powers. He's in the process of working through his identity, finding his own self, this process of self-discovery, right? And that is wrapped up in this experience of being raised by these 3 women, which from our vantage point is not as traditional, right? Again, we don't know enough about their community to know how common this is, but I can tell you right now, gem people, I think we're getting the impression that gem people are not common. Yeah. And that identifier is unique.
Well, let's talk about what put him in there with them. Yeah. So his father's human. His mother is a 4th of the crystal gems, and she, I guess, fell in love with Greg and chose, we learn in the second episode, she chose to give up her physical form in order to have Steven. There's an implication that she is somewhere else, just not in a physical form. But Steven now has what appears to be a ruby type gem where his belly button should be.
You seem uncomfortable.
I'm very uncomfortable. I don't like, I don't know. There's something about the little chubby kid who lifts up his shirt and has like a little red ruby where his belly button should be. It's very uncomfortable for me.
Okay. I think that's going to be pretty consistent throughout the show. So hopefully you can adjust.
It's going to happen just about every time. Well, by the 5th episode, we see a lot of Steven.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the family dynamic is you've got a mother who gave up her life, at least in physical form, to have Steven, to give Steven life. Meanwhile, you've got 3 sort of sisterly figures raising Steven because Greg can't. Greg is not equipped to raise this kid who's going to grow up potentially to be a superhero using his power. In the first episode, we learn that he has not yet figured out what his power even is. He doesn't really even know what his gem does. And he is desperately trying to figure that out. All through, this is where it gets deceptively simple. The plot of this episode is that he is in love with ice cream sandwiches. I mean, a
very specific one.
The Cookie Cat. Which is funny because he's really only in love with Cookie Cat, it seems, because of the marketing of Cookie Cat. I mean, it comes with a cool song. There's even, I've got the audio here, I should play it. In the song, there's even trauma and drama in the song.
Oh, he's a frozen treat with an all-new taste, cause he came to this planet from outer space, a refugee of an interstellar war, but now he's at your local grocery store. Cookie Cat, he's a pet for your tummy. Cookie Cat, he's super duper yummy. Cookie Cat, he left his family behind. Cookie Cat! Now available at Gervin's off Route 109.
So like Cookie Cat even has a backstory that is really deep. And this is just to sell these ice cream sandwiches. And the kid loves these ice cream sandwiches, and they have been discontinued. And while eating one of the ice cream sandwiches, suddenly his gem begins to glow. And it's understood that the ice cream sandwich is fueling the glow of this gem, the power of the gem. And so he has a collection of the ice cream sandwiches and thinks that by eating those, he will be able to
Which
use...
isn't completely foolish, right? Because his tummy has the ice cream sandwich in it. You know, like that. It is what happened right before his shield emerged, and he realized that his superpower is associated with this huge protective shield.
A big pink shield. Yeah. We should say that each of the gems by the other sort of sisterly figures, the crystal gems, they all have very specific powers. Pearl has what appears to be sort of a spear-like blade. Garnet has big gauntlets. Amethyst has a whip with sort of spikies on the end. They're all offensive weapons. They are all meant to be used on the offensive, it would appear. It's interesting that when Steven's power is activated, it is a defensive weapon. It is a shield. And yes, it can be sent out as he learns from his stomach. His stomach can push it out and it can ricochet around the room and probably do a significant amount of damage. But I really like the idea that this kid has the power of defense, of protection, while his sisters are all more aggressive. What did you think about that?
I think that's a very important observation. And what's interesting is that in the next 4 episodes, we don't see the shield again. He's fixated on how to make the shield emerge. Like, what was the antecedent to the emergence of his weapon? It seems like the other... I really liked the first episode because the other crystal gems were sort of describing the way in which they could manifest their weapon,
how to control their power,
and all of them seem to imply that they could control them. Like all of them implied that this is a relationship they have with their superpower, and that they have agency over it,
but in very different ways.
Yes. So ranging from, if you are mindful and just kind of tuning in to yourself, having this self-awareness, being one with your weapon, it will emerge, to something a little bit more, I feel like Amethyst was just kind of a little bit more
she was flippant
chaotic about it.
Well,
like
she was like, when I need it, I just take it. I don't do anything, nothing special. I just grab it. And
Yeah, so it gives him some ideas that what he needs to do is gain control.
Yeah.
And he doesn't yet have that. And I think that...
he learns that when he thought that eating the cookie cat is what caused it, but then when he is confronted by a big monster, he decides to eat all of his cookie cats in the hope that he can protect his sisters. We're going to call them sisters. They seem like sisters. But nothing happens. He does end up saving the day in an entirely different way when we're going to talk about that aspect of the show here in a minute. But really, to me, if I were to interpret that original scene, it's the joy that he had while eating that cookie cat that brought out the shield. It wasn't necessarily the ice cream itself. It was this look of joy, because then when he ate the ice cream, it was to do it again. It was with purpose, and he's not going to, that same joy is not going to be there. It's not just the simple love of this ice cream sandwich. It was with purpose, and that became work. And suddenly it didn't work.
Yeah.
And
it was like not natural.
Yeah.
And I think we'll continue to see things unfold with his relationship with his weapon and more so with his gem. How does he perceive his gem? And when certainly already we know the gem is associated with his mother and
rose quartz.
Yeah. So there's this connection to his gem. It's very personal. It is relating to someone who he knows loved him, but is not on this earth, not in this universe in the same way that others are. And that's meaningful to him. And I think that in the first episode, it was very clear that, and this is something, Brian, that you mentioned, that we're meant to understand he's on this journey. He's in his youth. He is in a particular stage of development that is one that we need to remember, like what it's like to be so curious and open and not
simple.
Fearful.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, simple, but also...
I don't mean that in a negative connotation.
No, you don't mean intelligence.
No. I just mean a much simpler time. And yes, we are going back and forth between these 5 episodes, but in episode 5, Frybo, there is this brilliant speech. In fact, there was a tweet that we got from one of our dear friends, Krista Starr, where she said at first she wasn't on board with Steven Universe, but then Petey gave a monologue about working just for money, and she was just super impressed. And I've got the audio of that monologue.
This seahorse used to make me so happy. Now it's just giving me whiplash. I feel like there's just no point to it. You know what I mean?
I just feel tingly.
You'll understand when you have a job.
I do have a job. I protect humanity from magic and monsters and stuff.
I mean a real job that you get paid for.
I'm paid in the smiles across the town's faces.
I don't see anyone smiling. You pick up a job to buy a house or raise kids or to impress your dad. You work away your life, and what does it get you?
Smiles and faces?
No. You get cash. Cash that can't buy back what the job takes. Not if you rode every seahorse in the world.
Whoa. Wanna try the jellyfish?
As you can hear in this monologue, you've got a child who has now gotten his first job, and he now understands that life is bigger than just going to the boardwalk and having fun on this simple quarter operated ride. It doesn't bring him the same love. It doesn't bring him the same joy. He has now been tainted by adulthood. And Steven has not yet been tainted by that adulthood. He is still sitting right next to him on a similar ride and getting the same tingling sensation that he always does. And then his explanation to Petey is, well, have you tried this ride instead? He is still simple. He is still untouched by adulthood. And I think that helps him. And well, I haven't even seen a place where it hinders him yet.
Well, he is in a situation where he's at risk a lot of times because there are supernatural and interstellar threats to this community. And it seems to be that his family is, they are responsible for serving the community and keeping it safe. But you mentioned something, when you talk about the simplicity of his mindset, there is the overt understanding that he is still in a youthful phase.
Yeah.
What reason would he have to be? It's almost like the kid he's talking to is going through that transition, the realization that I can't just do things that are fun anymore.
Yeah.
I have to earn a living. Like, this is daunting and it's something I don't want to do.
Yeah.
And Steven being 11, 12, he's in this adolescent stage. This is the stage developmentally that a person is starting to wrestle with certain questions. And they're posed in particular, and this work comes from many, many researchers and psychologists, but I have to mention that Erikson is one of the most, I would say, groundbreaking developmental researcher who really discovered and set forth the stages of psychological development, and notes that really around this phase, there is the task of developing individuality. This is what Stephen is facing, this sense of individuality. And in addition, alongside this sense of self, or the sense of the emerging self, he's wrestling with issues that have a lot to do with the transitions and roles that he's asked to carry, or that he may be asked to carry. One of them being like, well, so what are you going to do with your life? Like, imagine, Brian, how old were you when you were first asked, like, well, what do you want to do? What do you want to do when you grow up?
I mean, we're always asked that as young kids, but when was I first asked that seriously? Probably around this age, probably 12-ish, probably, right before you start going into middle school and high school, where you've got to start thinking about your future.
And that really marks an important transition, which is like, at that point, moving forward, well, you better start working on that.
Yeah.
I think that's the underlying message. Of course, there are other underlying messages with that. What interests you, what excites you, how do you see your future? And those are all important things too. But I do think that our culture, especially the Western culture, especially the culture in the US, is to begin to frame someone's identity development with making money, with having a profession and sort of earning their way.
Yeah.
And I like that they started to show us that he isn't quite that he's there, like he's kind of on the cusp of these huge transitions happening.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of just sort of the simplicity, the third episode, Cheeseburger Backpack, was a favorite of mine because Stephen convinces the other three crystal gems to take him along for a mission, and it's to place a statuette in a certain spot so that at a certain time a ray of light comes down and it saves the ruins. It saves the temple from their past, from their homeland. We're not 100% sure what this is yet. And I also like that too. It's a show that is going to, I imagine, fill out these details as the show progresses. It's not spending too much time with exposition now. He comes along and he fills up his brand new cheeseburger backpack, which is exactly what it sounds like, a backpack shaped like a cheeseburger, which he ordered specifically to help with missions because he cannot get his gem to work. Therefore, he is looking for other ways to be helpful. Isn't that exactly what a child would do? A child would say, well, I don't have powers, but I've got this and I can put things in it in order to help us. And I can be the person who brings these things along. And Stephen goes to his room to not just put the statuette in, but also to put in everything else he thinks would be important. And what does he put in? Toys and food and just things that you would think would be ridiculously unnecessary for this mission. And yet many of the items that he puts into this backpack end up getting used. Again, we find that Pearl is the alpha that will initially, there's a moment where these like crystal caterpillars are in their way, and if you touch them, there's the implication that somehow you could die, or they'll eat you or something. And so Pearl devises the scheme to get past them by each one of them doing something. And before she's even finished her plan, Steven has thrown donuts out onto the floor and the little crystal caterpillars go to eat the food. That is what a child would do. It sort of, to me, showed the difference between the way that a child thinks and maybe the fact that adults overly complicate solutions to simple problems. Again, it's that difference between what it means to be a child and what it means to be an adult, and Steven has tapped into that mainly because he's never escaped it. He's still just
he
doing,
doesn't know any other way.
doesn't know any other way. I mean, when I was a small kid, I want to say third grade, I know I was living in North Carolina at the time. I distinctly remember this. Like all children do, I decided to run away from home for no particular reason. I probably saw a movie or a TV show where it's like, put on a backpack and I'm going to go have an adventure around town. And I got all the way to the edge of the driveway and was like, I don't want to do this after all. But when I packed up my bag,
yeah, what went in your backpack?
my toys, all my toys, no clothes, no food.
Oh, you weren't gonna survive on that.
Yeah, the things that I needed were my toys, and Steven does the same thing. He puts in stuff like his favorite stuffed animal. He puts in, well, surprisingly, he does put in a raft. He puts in donuts. He puts in, it's just all of his favorite things. And he kind of looks at them with joy as he's like, oh, this is going to come in handy. And he stuffs it in his backpack. And most adults would look at that and be like, that is a ridiculous choice. And yet it helps.
And yet it makes sense. And well, you're right. It helps in his own way tremendously.
Yeah.
But also, the piece about his choices here remind us that he is a child, and actually your basic needs are taken care of by adults.
Yeah.
Why would he think about his meals, his shelter,
right?
The things that are about survival. And so it makes a lot of sense. But it also reminds us too, he needs to be taken care of. I guess I'm speaking from the perspective of again wanting to protect him, that somebody's got to look out for this kid because he's still a kid.
Yeah. One of the moments that is the most telling to me is the moment that he pulls out of his cheeseburger backpack. There's a sort of a river that's between them and where they need to be. And he pulls out of the cheeseburger backpack an inflatable raft. And you think it's going to be ridiculous, but it's actually the most practical thing in his backpack. And all three of the other crystal gems applaud him for the practicality and that actually is useful. And it turns out to be the least useful item in his backpack because the moment he inflates it and puts it on the water, it goes downstream and falls off a waterfall that inevitably would have killed them all. So even that is it's not so hot to be an adult sometimes. It's your thinking is going to get you in trouble. Listen to the kids sometimes.
Yeah, and we have to throw into the mix our understanding of personality traits. Around this time, there are very clear, very solid personality traits that emerge. I would say that around this time, you're going to have personality traits that will stay fairly long-standing. Maybe not permanent, but pretty long-standing. In other words, that they will be steady throughout his life.
So you're saying up to this point, it could be flexible, it could be fluid, but right around the ages of 11, 12, somewhere in there, you might be solidified.
Yeah, not necessarily at this age, but by this age.
Yeah.
So there are some traits in thinking of personality traits. There are some traits that are very apparent, really, really young. Some would say infancy. You've probably heard of the acronym OCEAN, which kind of stands for these macro personality traits. Have you?
I don't know that I've.
You haven't. Have you taken like a personality inventory where you fill out a bunch of questions and then it gives you this outcome or output that says like, Brian, you are high on these traits, low on these traits.
Maybe. I've taken a bunch of tests like that. I don't remember Ocean specifically.
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
Oh, well, you've probably heard of the Big Five, which is commonly used as a term to refer to these big macro, broad personality traits, which include agreeableness, extroversion, openness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. Neuroticism, I would also say like emotional instability.
Okay.
These are well researched, and I would say throughout the last few decades really continue to stand out as covering most of our personality traits. Although when you look at these longer inventories, I mean, some researchers say that there are as many as 4,000 micro traits, like 4,000 personality traits that we could all vary on. And there's also other inventories that drill down to like 16 factors or 8 personality factors. But these 5 tend to hold true, and they tend to be fairly predictive of longstanding features,
Okay.
Meaning like throughout your life, you're going to be pretty stable across these dimensions. And I say dimensions, these are all on a spectrum. Usually most of us will kind of fall in the middle in many of these traits. Let's talk a little bit about these traits. And I want to think about Stephen in particular as we go through them, because I'm finding that already he's showing some features and aspects that tell me what kind of adult he might be.
Oh, okay.
So I mentioned openness. So openness means somebody tends to be more adventurous. They might be more creative. Like clearly he could be high on this. If you're high on this particular trait, you're open to trying new things. You are happy to think about new and even abstract concepts. You are very creative. If you're low on openness, you don't like change, you don't like new things. This is me sometimes. Like, look, and you're not very imaginative if you kind of score low on this trait. When we think about Stephen, he is imaginative. He's curious. He's very open to new experiences. And many children are. I know you're about to say, or you might think like, well, this is a childhood trait. Some children don't show these features. Some children are reticent or reluctant to engage in novel things, or they may be less imaginative. And so everything is on a spectrum, right? Everything is relational. So we're comparing Stephen to other youth his age.
So like Egon Spengler was given a half a slinky once, but he straightened it.
Yeah, I don't.
So he wasn't the same he didn't take the same love. He was more curious and just taking it apart and seeing.
Yeah, he might be more rigid.
Yeah.
Well, this might be more appropriate for him. So I mentioned conscientiousness. This includes high levels of thoughtfulness, really good self-control.
Yeah.
Really like future-oriented, goal-directed,
Wow.
organized. So people who are conscientious, they prepare. They are task-oriented. They really pay attention to the details, and they're schedule-oriented.
And this is not Stephen.
This is not
Stephen. Is a mess.
No, folks or children who are low on this trait, they dislike structure. They dislike schedules. And again, we're thinking about him in relation to other youth his age.
But that's interesting because in the 4th episode, Together Breakfast, all he wants is just to share breakfast with the other 3. He just wants them to have a family unit sitting down and enjoying breakfast together. So there is a little bit of that.
I hear what you're saying. And, initially I was going to disagree with you, but I think you're right. I think it's not rigidity, but it seems like this is how we do breakfast.
Yeah.
Like we all need to be sharing these pancakes.
Or this is how we should be doing breakfast.
Yes.
Well, and he even looks at the stack of pancakes, which he has covered with chocolate and whipped cream and a cherry. And he has decided that this is a stack of pancakes that can't be eaten by one person. This needs to be shared.
That's pretty good impulse control. He is delaying gratification. He's controlling the self. Like, I would agree with you there. We don't see a lot of that from him, though.
No.
What we do see is extroversion, which is a personal excitability, someone who's sociable, someone who's talkative, says what's on their mind. So we would say someone who's very expressive emotionally. And we see this in him. Someone who's extroverted likes to have conversations, likes to initiate conversation, enjoys meeting new people, tends to make friends easily, and is energized around others. Folks who are low on extroversion, of course, the term is introversion. They prefer solitude for the most part. They feel exhausted when they have to socialize quite a bit. They find it difficult to initiate conversations and might dislike small talk. And they dislike being the center of attention. And again, this is on a spectrum. And think about this from the perspective of like a 12-year-old. We see children who really fall into more of that introverted, feature or set of features where they're not likely to make friends easily, or they're reluctant to talk, or they're shy. So
how much of that can change over the course of that childhood, though? At what point or what sort of factors can alter the identity of the child? I ask because I like to think, and obviously my parents may remember differently, but I think that I was probably, when I was born in Hickory, North Carolina, lived in Conover for the first few years of my life, and I had a lot of friends. I had the neighbor kids that were right across the street. I had a couple of friends that were down the street. And the moment I moved, it changed my perception of reality. I then moved to Nashville, where I had one friend. And I moved then to Boone, North Carolina, where I basically had one friend. I had a couple of friends, but I only had one strong friend at any given time. Moved to Virginia, where I really had one friend down the street. That became a theme for me, because once you realize, every couple of years you're going to move, every 3 or 4 years you're going to move. Well, really, what's the point in having a collection of friends? You just sort of love them and leave them. Because after those 3 or 4 years, I then really wouldn't speak to them ever again. With the exception of my best friend now, and only then I re-met him in college. But. And I'm not going to say that my entire life changed just because of that, but I then noticed, I was a little precocious redheaded kid. I loved the ladies. I had a crush in like every class that I had. I remember being outgoing, and I created a puppet show out of a Nike box for this one girl, Sabrina, in class. She didn't like it as much as I had hoped. She turned me down. It wouldn't be my steady. This was in first grade. Wouldn't be my steady. And then the only girl I ever liked, third through sixth grade, turned me down. Then seventh, so like
yeah.
So what I'm saying is,
yet you did continue to be extroverted and outgoing.
but I wasn't. I got beaten down to the point. Like, it took decades for me to get to a point where I almost feel like I'm back to where I maybe always was, or should have been, where now I can go up and talk to people, and but it took years. I mean, I was well into college, whereas like any party that I ever went to, I just stood in a corner and just kind of watched people for 45 minutes to an hour before deciding to talk to them. And that didn't change until well after college. So, I mean, when I look back at high school, I had one friend really in high school. But I'm wondering.
I mean, yeah, I can sense that what I can sense that this is a fundamental question that comes up for a lot of people, which is like, can I change my personality?
Yes.
And fundamentally,
by the way, I'm not blaming my parents or my dad or anything like. Like I'm not blaming any of.
No, look, you turned out great.
Yeah, I think so.
Right. So, yes, you're going to have these little micro changes, these transitions throughout your life. Fundamentally, I would say the majority of our traits tend to be pretty stable.
Yeah.
But we go through life experiences that do impact who we are. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And researchers talk about the transition to trait effects that they have influence over our personalities. And usually this is what might be more common around adolescence, early adulthood, where a very important life transition, a change in the environment, does impact one's personality. Not really tremendously, but to the level maybe like what you're talking about, where certain traits get dialed up or dialed down.
Yes.
One in particular is relevant to Steven Universe, which is openness. Openness as a trait is predicted to steadily increase when youth leave the parental home.
Really?
And yeah, what's interesting is, and of course, this is interacting with all sorts of other environmental and genetic factors.
Now, you're talking about youth being like 18 or 17, 18 when you leave?
Yes.
Or are you talking about like at the age of 13, you left the parental home and went someplace else?
For most youth, I'd say that this transition occurs depending on cultures and depending on, norms, societal norms. That typically happens between 18 and 21. And in our culture, it often happens with the college transition or the beginning of like a professional chapter,
Sure.
the getting a job and being able to fend for oneself financially. Sure. But foster youth do this all the time. And it's found that, of course, a foster youth may leave their home of origin or transition to different home situations to the degree that they do adapt. They adapt. Some adapt quite well, and openness is something that, as far as a personality trait, could steadily increase during that time.
I certainly see the whole like 17, 18, I'm excited to be out of mom and dad's home. I'm going to go experience life, and suddenly you're open to new experiences that you weren't allowed to experience when you were a kid. But I could also see it going the other way, where suddenly you become less open because all those things, like you said, are provided to you by your parents or your parental units. Some sort of guidance provided by a guardian is suddenly gone, and then maybe you aren't as open, you shut down, you become a little more protective because suddenly you don't have this same world experience. And I could easily see that happening, but you're actually saying that in general, people tend to just become more open.
And someone like Martin Seligman, a psychologist who studies personality, would say it really depends on the person's explanatory style, which I'm going to get
Sure.
to. In mentioning some of these different personality traits, interestingly, things that I think Steven Universe would have a lot of, just in terms of his personality traits: agreeableness, emotional stability, and social dominance, which is another way of saying extroversion. I kind of like the phrase social dominance, are traits that actually can steadily increase when a youth experiences a new social role. And we don't yet know when he transitioned from his father being his caretaker to this new family.
Yeah.
And I'd say that transition certainly impacted the development of his personality traits. We didn't really get into the nitty-gritty of agreeableness, so I do want to mention that agreeableness is probably something that he would score high in. This is a dimension that includes trust and kindness, affection, being pro-social. Someone who is agreeable might be more cooperative. And with Steven Universe, I could see his personality really aligning with some of these features, and an interest in other people, feeling empathy and concern for others, enjoys helping others. Who's the kid in episode 5? Like immediately he wants to help him. Petey. And folks who are low on agreeableness don't take a lot of interest in others. They don't have as much care or concern or interest in how other people feel. They may not understand that they have an impact on others, and may inadvertently be belittling or insulting. And they sometimes can take advantage of other people. And again, those are the two extremes. All of us are going to be somewhere in between. I would say those milestones or those markers at the extremes. Neuroticism, which again, I prefer saying things like emotional stability. This is a predictor of mental health issues and is important to think about, because neuroticism, especially among children and adolescents, could link to the development of anxiety disorders and depression. Neuroticism is a trait characterized by inherent sadness, moodiness, and you may see things like anxiety, irritability, some levels of stress even. Some children who are higher on neuroticism worry about many, many different things. They may get upset easily. They, as I said, they could feel concern and ruminate. And bouncing back is a little bit more difficult for them. But folks who are low on neuroticism, in other words, they're higher on emotional stability, they deal okay with stress. They do feel sad and depressed occasionally, but can overcome. They don't worry as much, and they can achieve relaxation. They can self-comfort. They can calm themselves, and that's important, because those are aspects of resilience. And in capturing all this, I'd say that Steven is particularly resilient, and probably not a child, given what we're seeing. We know he has a history of parental separation. We know he has a history of trauma, because he has a parent who's, from what we understand, she's passed away. She's sort of left her physical body,
this earth.
And he, he might be at risk for adolescent and young adult mental health concerns.
That's something that I wanted to ask you, and I think we'll certainly see more, and I don't know if we will, but people say that the show gets deep emotionally and psychologically, but I found myself wondering, if you're talking 10, 11, 12, we don't really know how old he is right off the bat. I'm sure somewhere down the line we might find out, but I'm wondering what happens to Steven, given the fact that, like you said, there's parental, I don't want to say abandonment, but certainly separation from both parental units. There is this longing to know who he is and what he can do, and a frustration that comes when he has no idea what his gem does or how to activate it or how to control it. And then he is constantly traumatized by monsters every week and these different adventures and experiences. I find myself wondering what happens to a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid who is faced with that his entire life, or what happens when he grows up.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned Martin Seligman a little bit earlier, and you were asking, like, okay, how fixed are these traits? We already see that this kid is resilient. He's enthusiastic about life. He's clearly...
When does that wear down?
Yeah. Like, what's going to happen to this child? These are all, as I said, these can be predictors of his future functioning, which is telling. And yet we know that, in answer to your question, there are some life experiences that can impact our personalities, and in fact, how we think about ourselves, how we think about our own lives, like what is befalling us, what is challenging us, what is out there in the world that we're encountering. Our interpretation of our environment is a really big factor. And I don't know how much we've talked about Martin Seligman. He is a psychologist who back in the 70s, so not quite your favorite time in the history of psychological research, but
yeah, it got boring. Got boring after they started shutting down.
Still during a time where the element of introducing pain and torture to your subjects was a whole part of the territory.
Sure.
In the 70s, he did an experiment on dogs, which helped him develop the theory of learned helplessness. So what he would do is he put dogs in situations, usually in a cage, where they got this uncomfortable electric shock. It wasn't harmful to them, but it was something that they would try to avoid. And in cases where they could do nothing about it, in other words, they could not move their body to avoid the shock, they found that dogs actually became conditioned to it. And they were preferring the shock to a new situation where it was clear.
So you wouldn't let the dog out of the cage because the dog wouldn't know where the shock was coming from.
Even when they were put into a new situation where there was a clear opportunity to escape, they still didn't do it.
Yeah.
So they
It's
were
the known
passive
versus the unknown. Yeah.
Yes, they were passive and willing to be uncomfortable. So that's what this learned helplessness theory really came from, is understanding that we, in our life experiences, we could learn to be passive. We could learn to withstand and tolerate a negative environment. He also was interested in how we could learn to be optimistic. And although optimism isn't one of the big five, clearly it's hugely related to agreeableness, for instance, and openness. So there's a lot of loading on to those big five, those particular big five traits. Interestingly, when he talks about optimism, and he can be problematic for various reasons, but when he talks about optimism, this is what I appreciate in terms of his framing of it. And Steven Universe is like this to a T. They surround themselves with upbeat people. They're very forgiving of others, and they're grateful. They're grateful not just for big things. They're grateful for the smallest little things in life. And they smile. They just smile.
He's constantly smiling.
This is him. Like his eyes go into this whole other form.
Well, they become stars.
Yeah. So that's Steven Universe. And what Seligman found is that if you don't have a child who's like that, you can prepare him to be like that. He said that you have to think about these three ways to interpret life adversities. One, are we interpreting the hardship as temporary or permanent? Is it changeable? If it's something that we acknowledge is permanent, like it's not something we can change, we tend to be more helpless, obviously. So I think that's something that will come into play with Steven's personality.
We'll see.
The second thing is control. How much control do we have over the situation? Or over the outcome. So if we had a negative outcome, let's say that a college student got a really bad score on an exam, and they tell themselves like, well, this is because, I didn't sleep at all. I was hungover. Like it's something I can actually control. It's not because I'm unintelligent. I'll study better next time and I'll get a better grade. That is that sense of agency and control over that outcome. The third element has to do with whether this hardship is pervasive.
Okay.
Is it something that always seems to happen to you, or is it just kind of this one time? And obviously, we can overcome something if we interpret it as a chance thing or something that isn't going to be common for us. Maybe you thinking back, Brian, to your experiences, like, I would think that you experienced rejection several times.
Yes, many times.
Actually, that seems to be pervasive for you for a period of time that may have impacted your level of optimism.
I mean, it shut me down.
Yeah.
It literally shut me down to the point that, like, in high school, I didn't, people talk about going to high school parties and hanging out with high school friends. I didn't have any. I had one friend really, in the second high school I went to, and he was a year older than I. So my senior year of high school, I had really no one. I mean, I certainly talked to people in school. I wasn't a complete loner. I was friends with them. I just didn't hang out with them afterward. And part of that was I just didn't, by that point, you can only be made fun of for being a redhead so many times. You can only be turned down by girls you like so many times. You can only be, and I realize I'm starting to sound like an incel. But
wow, this could have gone completely different way.
But I got through it. It got better. I got through it, and I ended up meeting people in college, and I met people afterward where this is a prime example of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I opened up after I left that environment. After when suddenly it was a place that I had chosen to go, and surrounded myself with people I wanted to be around, I opened up to new experiences, and man, science.
It's real. And I think we should apply that to Stephen, right? That we're seeing very fundamental, very stable traits. And we also know that he's going to have some experiences that might influence those factors in some way, that he's already had life experiences that have impacted his outlook. Lastly, what Seligman does say is that if helplessness is something that we are seeing among adults, but in particular, he was studying youths, and whether they had some of these traits of optimism and helplessness, he said that it's really about retraining explanatory style. That did seem to help. It's identifying the underlying assumptions. Is this individual thinking in a way that that tends to be characterizing their hardship as permanent, pervasive, and uncontrollable? That's where the intervention should really happen. Let's retrain or reframe those thoughts to be a little bit more flexible. This is temporary. This is changeable. This is controllable. And this is not an ongoing threat to me. This will end. So I think that's a helpful way to think about how we can overcome some of that helplessness, all of us really, and think in a little bit more optimistic ways. We're yet to learn how Stephen will encounter his hardships and what's to come. And I sort of want to just kind of give him a big hug.
It's because he's just this little chubby kid that is just so adorable. You can't help but to just want to squeeze him. So I think it's fair to say that you've been won over. You can't wait for the next batch of episodes. It seems like we're going to be covering these in 5 episode arcs. I don't want to say arcs because they're not really arcs, but each episode of the Arkham session will cover 5 episodes of the season. There are 52 episodes of the season total. So, at this pace, it really won't take us that long to get through season 1. And then you'll be able to vote to see if we continue with season 2 or if we move on to something else. Where can you vote on that, Drea?
You can go to our Patreon,
Yep.
which is the Arkham Sessions.
Yep.
And you can find us online. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. And my account is at Arkham Asylum Doc, and my website is drdreapsychology.com.
You can find me. I am at bward028 on Twitter. I am b_ward028 on Instagram. Come find us both. We are at Arkham Sessions on Twitter, at the Arkham Sessions on Instagram. Come find us on Facebook. Join our Patreon, like Drea said, patreon.com/Arkham Sessions. And you can find now Batman the Animated Series, you can find Doom Patrol, you can find Steven Universe, and you can find Batman Beyond, I think, all on HBO Max. These are all things we cover in one form or another. They're all in one place. So go and check out HBO Max. Oh, you can also find Steven Universe on Hulu.
Yeah.
Go check them out and follow us as we explore Steven Universe. Until next time, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
And together we are
The Arkham Sessions.